Pooja Shah is the head of product at Protocol Labs, and she'll be talking about networked OKRs and milestone bounties, Protocol Labs' approach to aligning and funding ecosystem progress in a more decentralized fashion. Welcome, Pooja.
Hello, how's it going? Awesome. All right, let me share screen. Okay, so as Carla mentioned, I'm going to be talking about networked OKRs and milestone bounties. And again, my name is Pooja and I work at Protocol Labs. So today, just to give a brief sort of roadmap of this conversation, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we think these mechanisms are important, and then dive into a little bit how we think about networked OKRs and milestone bounties specifically. So giving you some definitions, since these may not be familiar terms for a lot of people, and then diving into how they can be useful in aligning decentralized ecosystems and some of the experiments we're going to be running here within the Protocol Labs ecosystem. So I wanted to start by taking a step back and looking at some of the differences between centralized companies, where a lot of product and engineering work in our world has been done for the last several centuries, versus decentralized ecosystems. So, I was comparing on a number of different dimensions. When you think about centralized companies, often these are organizations where you can think of the actual organization as a graph that has a single root. The direction of growth of these types of organizations tends to grow with increasing depth and of the graph. But when companies tend to want to grow in new directions, sometimes they can struggle to expand the breadth of focus that they have. These companies also sometimes can, the impact that these companies can achieve can be constrained by headcount. So how many people directly work for this organization, how centralized companies orient the massive set of folks that are working within the company tends to be through centralized planning. But on the plus side, these sorts of structures have historically been very effective for hard engineering efforts that require really tight coordination between a number of different people, where there are dependencies between lots of different groups within the organization, but they can all collectively coordinate together in order to have some really massive impact. Obviously, all of us are here today because we're really excited about decentralized ecosystems and the direction that these ecosystems will go in the future, and the potential that decentralized ecosystems have to really have some incredibly massive impact as the arrow of time moves forward. So just to contrast against some of these dimensions, with decentralized ecosystems, an org chart is not really a reasonable concept, but if you were to think of the Ethereum ecosystem or the IPFS ecosystem, for example, as an organization, it would look like many different graphs of different companies that have many roots, who are the leaders of the various different groups within an ecosystem. The way that decentralized ecosystems can grow, I believe, can be in both deepening in particular directions, but also experimenting with new use cases and just really growing in terms of breadth as well. The impact that an ecosystem can achieve is not really constrained by this notion of headcount or the people that are within the ecosystem today, but it really looks a lot more like what is the latent talent in the industry. So the people that are broadly within this particular ecosystem, we're working on adjacent projects, or that might be interested in working in a similar space in the future. And especially as an industry grows, this can become extremely massive, like a massive force of people that are oriented around similar directions. In terms of direction setting for decentralized ecosystems, to date, a lot of what we've seen looks like, soft influence, like people writing blog posts and having really big followings on Twitter and other places where people are interested in hearing what leaders of these ecosystems have to say. But one of the downsides that I believe we have seen so far is that sometimes decentralized ecosystems can be a little bit less effective when projects are active that require really tight coordination and have lots of dependencies. And so one of the big questions that we think about a lot within Protocol Labs is, how do you align participants in a decentralized ecosystem? We really want to be able to lean into some of the benefits that I mentioned before, but we don't want to lose the benefits of really tight coordination and efficiency when it comes to difficult engineering challenges that we have seen centralized companies be really successful with. And so one of the core principles that kind of underlies this entire set of experiments that we're looking into is this belief that in decentralized ecosystems, teams are often doing really, really valuable work that ultimately accrues value to the protocol layer. And so here are some examples within the IPFS and Filecoin ecosystems. One really great example is we just announced that within the Filecoin protocol, we are soon going to be launching the Filecoin virtual machine, which will enable user-generated smart contracts. And so things like this, which are not necessarily revenue-generating projects, but obviously anyone can see that they are extremely valuable and they will drive a lot of new use cases and development and experimentation within the protocol ecosystem. And so when we think about how do we align participants in an ecosystem, funding mechanisms are really, really important, obviously. And there are two core needs that these funding mechanisms need to achieve. So the first is making sure that participants have in the ecosystem have the upfront working capital that they need to go after these really high impact projects. And then on an ongoing basis, they also need additional funding to reward the impact that they were able to generate. Some of the principles that have been guiding us as we've been thinking about different funding mechanisms include, we need to make sure we're delivering really significant and proportional upside for teams. These primitives need to be really modular and flexible. This is sort of, I think this entire conference sort of shows a number of different ideas and different ways in which we can accomplish similar objectives. And so this is, one set of experiments and one set of ideas, which we expect to change and grow over time. Another core principle is that this should feel really abundant as we're all doing extremely impactful work. This is a rising tide that really is going to lift all boats, and so there shouldn't be this feeling of scarcity or competitiveness within the ecosystem. And then another principle here is that we're aiming to reward impact, not effort. So the set of mechanisms that within the Protocol Labs network that we've been thinking about are designed to fund teams working on impact generating work that doesn't necessarily need to be revenue generating, although it can be. And to collectively, these mechanisms should be able to create an environment where teams can pursue opportunities faster, achieve higher impact, and earn many more rewards than they would today in a more centralized sort of setting. So one framework that we've been using to think about this set of mechanisms is this, this chart here, which sort of has two main dimensions. The first dimension is whether the impact was something that was predicted to be impactful, or whether it was just a creative new project that someone came up with and that ended up being very impactful, but that as direction setters in an ecosystem, maybe it wasn't recognized up front that this would be a very impactful project. So that's kind of the row at the top, predictable impact versus unpredicted impact. And then the column on the left talks about whether the funding is upfront. So it's upfront working capital that's based on impact that is expected to come down the road versus funding that is based on realized impact. So some of the retroactive funding examples that we have heard about and will hear about throughout the rest of this conference. So when we think about funding that is this sort of upfront working capital, there are many different kinds of grants that we think are really the right, there's so many creative iterations and different nuances to how you can implement grants that achieve a number of different objectives here. But grants really are the primary mechanism that we've seen be really successful when it comes to funding based on prospective impact. But when it comes to funding based on realized impact, there are two mechanisms that we've been iterating around that we think are very interesting and we wanted to present today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of milestone bounties, which is rewarding work that has been completed, the impact has been realized, and it was something that was predicted to be impactful upfront. Okay, so before I start talking a little bit about milestone bounties, I want to talk about this concept of networked OKRs. And this goes back to this idea of how centralized organizations and decentralized ecosystems can orient groups of people. So within centralized companies, many folks are probably familiar with OKRs. Not every company in the world uses OKRs, but it's become increasingly a very common mechanism to do central planning for organizations. And so in a company like Google, you would see something like this massive OKR tree where there's a set of objectives that are set by the executives, and each of the various different groups within Google will take that top level set of company goals and then interpret what that means for their organization, and it'll sort of like hierarchically trickle down throughout the rest of the organization. So this is a pretty effective mechanism for companies, but there are some challenges to planning in this way. The first thing is that this is a really insular way of doing planning for an organization. Often these OKRs at the company level or at the organization, like sub-organization level, is very opaque to the broader ecosystem. And so therefore it's difficult to tell other people what are some of the goals that this organization is planning to achieve in this year, or whatever the time frame is. Another challenge is that often this sort of planning process is scoped with headcount capacity in mind. So that ends up being a constraint for the impact that this organization can have more broadly. And then the last challenge is that this type of planning works pretty well, but when you compare it to alternatives that look much more like market-based planning, this as a solution looks very inefficient when you're talking about expressing the massive breadth and depth that exist across an entire ecosystem. So thinking about not just Google itself, but the massive ecosystem of products that have been built around Google's suite of core products, this sort of like structure is very difficult to use to express that complexity and diversity. In contrast, there's this idea that we've been calling networked OKRs. And this is really because the core principle when we're talking about organizing work and coordinating with others in a decentralized ecosystem, we want to make sure that we're engaging as many people as possible on the top priorities in an ecosystem and really growing the size of that ecosystem overall. So it's not about the headcount of one particular company, but really who is available, or interested in the set of challenges that these projects are trying to accomplish, and can we get them aligned towards those priorities? The other really great benefit here with thinking about this from the decentralized ecosystems perspective is that we don't want to be limited with what an ecosystem can achieve by just looking at the headcount constraints of a particular organization. And so there's a potential to achieve much more as an overall ecosystem if we are able to set network goals without thinking of headcount constraints. And then the last goal here is that we want to be able to create a system that is sustainable and scalable, especially as an ecosystem grows. And so the mechanisms that we've been leaning into are this idea of networked OKRs and milestone bounties. So networked OKRs are really just an open way to express priorities for an ecosystem. One kind of cute way I've been thinking of this is as a marketplace for high-skilled work. And really this is, you can imagine really anyone in an ecosystem that is a funder that deems some priority to be very important for the ecosystem overall can set an objective for the ecosystem, and any participant can work against that objective, and as they are doing so, earn rewards for participating in achieving an objective across the entire ecosystem. And so one of the things that's really important here are that these are, meaty, really crucial, big goals for an ecosystem, and it requires participation from a number of different individuals and groups in order to accomplish that particular objective. So that's networked OKRs, and so let's talk a little bit about milestone bounties. Milestone bounties are the very general definition for this concept is a reward that anyone can attach to complete a specific milestone, where a milestone really can be anything. A milestone could be a networked OKR, like we just mentioned. It could be a very specific project. It could be a multi-stage, multi-year roadmap, working towards advancing a particular KPI that some funder cares about. It really can be a number of different things, but one thing that's very important when we're talking about milestones in the context of orienting decentralized ecosystems is that they're not just small, narrowly scoped projects like bug and issue bounties, which is how most people think, I think today about bounties, but really milestones are intended to be sort of these like meaty, crucial projects that are really important to push an ecosystem in a valuable direction. And we're, when we talk about milestone bounties, we're talking about a very broad swath of high impact activities. So it includes protocol research and implementation, building developer tooling, ecosystem development, and much more. And one of the core ideas here too, again, going back to this idea of a marketplace of OKRs or goals for an ecosystem, the idea is that anyone within an ecosystem can set and fund the bounties for that ecosystem, and anyone can work on bounties, on bounty milestones as well. And these are some use cases for milestone bounties, which I won't go into, but I'll send these slides out as well, so folks can take a look at this in more detail later. So just jumping into a couple of case studies, which are, I think, really informative. And I know we just had Kevin on, so I'm sure he talked a lot about the amazing impact that the Gitcoin team has been able to accomplish and the ecosystem has been able to accomplish over the last few years. But I think these are really instructive because they sort of give a view into how these the loose structure of something like milestone bounties has been used in the past, and where the potential could be for this type of idea going forward. So one quick case study here. HackerOne, I'm sure a lot of folks are familiar with. It's a platform where hackers can earn rewards for solving issue and bug bounties, specifically focused around security for the most part. And HackerOne was founded in 2012, I believe, and since its founding, it's awarded something like $82 million total in funding. It's mostly used by a lot of Web 2 companies and has pretty low penetration in Web 3. But one of the things that I think is really, really interesting about HackerOne is that a significant majority of hackers that are participating in bounties on the HackerOne platform are doing it because they're interested in learning new skills, and they're doing it because they think it will help them from a career growth and advancement perspective. So I think that that's like really interesting and inspiring when we think about also the potential for an open marketplace of high skilled work to attract new people into an ecosystem, provide them with an opportunity to learn new skills and develop a portfolio, and then from there use that as a launch pad to do more impactful and meaningful work within an ecosystem going forward. So that's HackerOne as one quick example. Also looking at Gitcoin, and I took a look at the Gitcoin results page, which is really inspiring. Folks should go and take a look at that. But it's really interesting to see that, across a number of Web3 ecosystems, Gitcoin has already funded something like almost 230,000 fundees across a number of different projects. And there are also like many different use cases for bounties and grants that Gitcoin supports. And it's been really interesting to see kind of the diversity here and how people are using Gitcoin for different types of projects. The other two case studies I wanted to quickly talk about are grants so far within the Protocol Labs ecosystem and Ethereum Foundation grants. So to date, and I believe this is over maybe the last like 3 or 4 years, it really hasn't been that long, but Protocol Labs has awarded over $70 million or in grants over the last several years. And I think the very interesting thing about this is the grants start to look really big. So the average size, and again, of course, they're really different. It's like the distribution is not at all uniform, but the average grant in the Protocol Labs ecosystem over the last few years has been pretty big. We're starting to see, hundreds of thousands of dollars that are awarded in the average grant size. And the sorts of projects that have been awarded in our ecosystem over the last few years include really meaty big things like additional Filecoin implementations, really critical integrations into important partners like getting IPFS into browsers, and core services that are necessary for the ecosystem to really thrive, like pinning services and decentralized identity services and so on, cross-chain integrations, things like this. So it's, the projects are starting to become like really significant in terms of the scale and impact that they can have. And similarly, within the Ethereum Foundation, a lot of the grants that we've seen, they have been really massive, and it's also for really critical projects like additional implementations and so on, security audits, things like that. We've also been doing a number of interviews with folks across different ecosystems, and some of the things that have really jumped out are that well-structured grants and bounties can be extremely empowering and motivating for teams to, just have a focus and enough runway that they can go after some really critical network priorities and then just like be energized and go and accomplish those goals. Also, what I mentioned before with HackerOne, as an example, that these types of projects can be really impactful for new teams that are looking to enter an ecosystem that are really excited about the potential, but maybe don't have the legitimacy yet within the ecosystem to go after, to go and build like new products and feel confident that they will be successful. And so it can be a really powerful launch pad for new teams that are looking to enter an ecosystem as well. We've also seen a lot of grant funded teams and effectively what we're calling milestone bounty funded teams that have ended up growing and becoming really successful independent businesses. And also this type of structure can be really valuable to help orient an ecosystem around a particular set of goals that different funders think are really important. So we're still iterating on exactly what the structure of networked OKRs and milestone bounties will look like. We're running a number of experiments this quarter to dive deeper into this, but really the goal is for these mechanisms to become a highly effective means of decentralized work coordination in the Protocol Labs network in the short term, and then going forward in other ecosystems as well. And so some of the core KPIs that we have been focusing on are things like, how many teams have won these types of bounties, how many teams are able to sustain themselves primarily through bounty funding, how long does it take to matchmake between a published bounty or RFP and a fundee team, How valuable is this as, for people who are setting direction in ecosystems? How valuable is this for funders? It should be the case that funders love bounties because they help make amazing, useful things happen. So this is some of the stuff that we're really hoping to use to orient our project and see how successful this is. And just to kind of give you a view of where we are in the process right now, we're running several different projects, that some of which are actually like core dev and core protocol upgrades, things like that through this process, some of which are a little bit more auxiliary dev tooling and things. So just trying to get across a number of different use cases. We're launching a number of milestone bounties this quarter, and we'll be shepherding them from start to finish. And in parallel, leveraging the learnings from these experiments and from conversations we're having with a number of other folks to design a V1 process and platform that we're going to be launching next year. So in summary, there's a broad set of experiments that people are running. I think this is such an exciting space, and we're really, really excited to get to participate in running some experiments ourselves. But yeah, this is one area where we think it will be extremely valuable to help set priorities and direction for decentralized ecosystems in a way that feels really consistent with a lot of the values and ethos of Web3, and just like the idea of marketplaces where anyone can participate and they're fully open. We think that that's a really powerful mechanism, and so we're really excited to lean into networked OKRs and milestone bounties and report back on the learnings from these initial experiments. And that's me. I don't know if I have enough time for questions, but if not, then feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, and always happy to chat about these ideas in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Pooja, for a look at the future of OKRs and networked incentive alignment. I don't think we have very much time for questions right now. There was one question about whether the presentation will be available, and I believe the answer to that is yes. And as Pooja mentioned, she'll be available to take questions at the Twitter handle that she shared. And she shared in the chat, yes, that the presentation will be made available. We'll get that posted. And I'd like to